I'm going to talk really fast for the first 15 minutes to try and get through all the content that we need to, and then get into a demo of some of the stuff that we've been working on in regards to compliance. So first off, welcome. Thank you for choosing the session to come to today. The GDPR is a topic that a lot of people are talking about, yet no one really knows anything about. So it's really difficult to actually learn anything about it. So just a quick introduction. So my name's Stefan Chandler Garcia. I should speak Spanish, but I don't. My father is Mexican, my mother is Portuguese, and the Portuguese side of the family won growing up, as they do. And I work as a Salesforce architect for a consulting firm called Methods, based in the UK, and we do all government-based stuff, which means that, oddly, I really don't actually do much to do with the GDPR during the day. So I'm going to take you back in time and on a little journey back to when I was 17. I used to work in the fitness industry in America, in California, and a lot of the gyms are owned by hospitals. And hospitals have this really strict regulation called HIPAA in the United States. And so all of these gyms have really robust member management system, contract systems that use lots of personal information that are all regulated by this HIPAA regulation because they are medically based facilities in general. And I built this tool that helped you search the membership database better so that you could get information on customers quickly from the customer service desk. And at that point in time, I was still working in customer service, part-time in IT. And this man came up to the desk and scanned his membership card. And he said, "Can you just verify the address that you have on file?" And I said, "Yep, it's 123, blah, blah, blah." And he said, "Well, can you tell me which card this is? I think it's my son's." He scanned the card and I read out the name and he said, "Thank you. Someone broke into my car yesterday and they dropped their gym membership card on the floor, and you've just told me who broke into my car and where they live." Which is a massive privacy violation for that person. Even though they're a criminal, I shouldn't have been able to that easily get that information and give it to a third party without providing verification. And that's a flaw in our processes as well as a flaw in the applications that we were building. And from then, I've always been fascinated by how privacy impacts other parts of business. And so I fit right into the GDPR. So from there, I started working for a government program whose job it was to stimulate areas of STEM in the UK. One of our work streams was IoT, one of them was immersive technology, and the third was data protection and privacy. And so from about 2014, we were preparing SMEs to build tools for the GDPR before it was written into law. And so I have a lot of experience actually building out compliance-based applications for personal data on the Salesforce platform. And I've been doing that for about 2.5 years while working with this organization. So I then said, "Hey, a couple of people in the Salesforce world, do you know what the GDPR is?" About 2 years ago now, they all said no. And at the first French Touch Dream-In, I was talking to Carrie Townsend, who's here today, about it, and she was freaking out and said we had to do something about it. So we started a working group around the community, bringing together developers, admins, marketing users, business users, and just talking about the GDPR and understanding how it actually affects the work that we're doing. And so I started the GDPR Superheroes, and we run loads of community events around the UK. We're an unofficially sanctioned community group, I will say that. But we've had over 1,500 attendees. We're speaking at as many users groups as we can around the country and just making sure that everyone's on the same page when it comes to this thing, because it's really difficult. And if it affects one Salesforce customer, all Salesforce customers become an easy target. And that brings us to the problem, well, we'll get to in a second. So we're going to talk about the GDPR and personal data, the Salesforce approach and what they're doing, the individual objects, some key takeaways, and then a demo. Now, the problem that the GDPR brings for us as Salesforce users is that Salesforce can be too easy sometimes. You can turn on a fresh org, and you've got a contact record, and you can just upload everything that you have. And you've got a database full of personal information that you have no idea potentially where it's come from. And so what does that actually mean? So personal data under the GDPR, there are 3 roles that you need to understand. So the first one is the data subject. And we are all data subjects. We have information about us. We take that information and we give it to data controllers to provide us services for our data. So when you're signing up for something, you are giving your data to a controller. Now, from a business perspective, we all work with organizations, and we're controllers because we take personal data from subjects to run our businesses. We then take that data and we pass it on to data processors. Data processors are things like applications and tools, and organizations that have tools that use your personal data to do stuff with it. Salesforce being a good example of that. If you use Salesforce, the data subject gives you their data, you then take their data, you put it in Salesforce to process, Salesforce then spits it out back to you to use for your business. And so in that chain, we are data subjects and data controllers as our organizations, and we're giving our data to data processors. So when we talk about personal data is any piece of information, whether that be direct, online, or indirect identifiers that relate back to a person. There are no differences between B2B and B2C data. It's all personal data. The next is processing. None of this text actually matters because there's one word in this statement, and it's use. If you're using data, you're processing data. But I did highlight a few other ones in there. Things like storage and destruction are all considered processing. So to be honest, anything you do with data is processing, if that's personal data in this definition. And then the last one is profiling. So profiling is taking that data and putting it into a structured set. Now, it's very important to understand that when we talk about the GDPR, we are not talking about marketing. We're talking about using data generally. You shouldn't have the data unless you fall in line with the GDPR to even market to. The marketing is just a byproduct of actually processing and using the data. So when we talk about that, the GDPR brings in all of these rights that everyone talks about, the right to be informed, the right to data portability. We're not going to talk about any of these today because they're irrelevant unless you get down the foundation and basics of the regulation. And that actually brings us to Article 6, and it's the lawfulness of processing. So essentially, you have to meet criteria to even have someone's data. And those criteria break down to six points that we'll kind of go into and explain. So the first requirement is that you have consent to process the data. It's the one that everyone talks about because it's unambiguous consent. You must not have pre-tick checkboxes, etc., and all of that stuff. But it's not necessarily the only reason that you should have data. The second one is a contract. If you have a contract with someone, you can legally process their data as part of that contract. A great example of this would be an email I received from my employer that said, "Hello, Stefan, we need your consent before we can continue to process your data and send you emails. Can you give us your consent?" I sent them back an email and said, "I have a contract with you, here's my contract. You don't need to be asking me for consent if you have another lawful basis to have and use my data." The third one is vital interests. And those are for medically based purposes. So if you are processing data on behalf of a hospital or medical research facility, that process falls under vital interests. The fourth is a legal obligation. If you have a legal obligation to process data, then you can store that data. And the perfect yet ironic example of this is when someone has their data deleted from a database, you legally have to store a suppression of that data. If that is what your corporate counsel tells you to do. You have to store a suppression of that data that is not being used for selling or for marketing, but being used under a legal obligation to prove that you deleted this data on a certain period of time. Or if you provide warranties to your customers and someone has purchased a product from you that has a warranty of 7 years, they ask you to be removed from the database, you can then go back to them and say, "No, we're not going to remove you because you have a warranty on our product for 7 years. Can you nominate someone to take over this warranty? Or can we void the warranty and then remove you from the data set?" The fifth one is a public task. So if you're part of a government organization and processing data on behalf of them, you can store that data. And if you have legitimate interest over the data. Now, legitimate interest is a gray area that a lot of people are actually using as their fallback, yet no one has really defined. So there were a group of so the Article 29 Working Party is a group of organizations who work together to sort of define and help businesses comply with the regulation. They put together a study with the Information Accountability Foundation that can be found at informationaccountability.org that is an ethical legitimate interests framework that they have developed. And what it does is it's broken legitimate interest down into 5 buckets, whether or not the processing is beneficial, progressive, sustainable, respectful, and fair. And they've put together a scoring system that you can download and read in this paper when looking at processing under legitimate interest. But what it really boils down to is whether or not you're acquiring that data and both parties receive mutual benefit, and you treat that data with respect in that processing. It's something that you can do once or twice, but you don't want to be always going back to the same person using legitimate interest. And you need to be able to justify your reason for choosing legitimate interest as your mode of processing that data. So there are now, in line with those, a few personal data principles that we need to understand. The first one is purpose limitations. So purpose limitations states that you should only be storing someone's personal information for a specific purpose. And in line with that, we have storage limitations stating that that purpose and that data should only be collected to fulfill that purpose. The second that that purpose is completed, the data should be removed from the database. We'll talk about how that can elongate as well shortly. The third is data minimization, stating that you should only be storing data relevant to that specific purpose. And the perfect example of this is there's a service provider called Purple Wi-Fi that's become very big in the UK. And they will go to your business, bring in all of the kit to set up a hotspot in your business, and provide you with a portal. The only thing is that all of the customers become customers of Purple when signing up. Now, when you install this router in your business, by default, it sets up a registration form. And on that registration form, it asks for your gender. And you are required to supply your gender to access the Wi-Fi, which totally goes against all minimization principles, because there is no reason that they need my gender to provide the service of Wi-Fi connectivity. You could probably argue that they don't even need my personal information to do that, but they can get around that because they are providing the service. But it's about thinking around what data you actually need to provide that service. And it's an issue we have with a lot of the customers as a partner that we work with in Salesforce, because they want to track everything. And it doesn't matter. They want a custom field for this and a custom field for that and a custom field for your dog's name. And you have to be able to understand the regulation and go back and say that data minimization shouldn't allow us to collect all of this information. And we have to minimize the profiles that we're building about people down to those specific reasons we're collecting the data. The fourth is accuracy. So every individual has the right to have their data accurate in your database. And the reason being is that if my data is incorrect in your Salesforce instance, why is it important to you? If my data is spelled wrong or my email is bounced, why are you still storing the information? It obviously has no value to you in theory if you're not willing to keep it up to date. So every individual has the right to have their data kept accurate in a data set. One of the things that I would say get prepared for is people responding to automated emails saying, hey, you spelt my name wrong. And you have to go and then find a way to rectify that in the database. And the fifth is the right to erasure. It's the one that everyone talks about because it's kind of a big deal. Like, how are we going to delete data from Salesforce, whatever. And what I'm going to say is I don't actually think it matters that much, the right to erasure. Because if we actually look at the terms of it, there are a strict set of criteria that you have to achieve in order to delete someone's data. And the first one specifically is an individual has the right to have their data deleted from your data set if it's no longer necessary in relation to the purpose that it was originally collected. So if you can justify having a lawful basis of storing that data, you do not have to delete their data from your database. When the individual withdraws consent, and this is where I have to backtrack a little bit. When we look at those lawful basis, if consent is your only lawful basis, they withdraw their consent or unsubscribe, and then they'd like to be deleted, fine. You, in theory, have no purpose for that data anyways because they were just receiving communications from you. The third one is when the individual objects to processing and there is no overriding legitimate interest. So if you can justify an overriding legitimate interest for processing the data, then that is fine. You have that justification. The next is when the personal data was unlawfully processed. Well, if you have a lawful basis for processing the data, it's not being unlawfully processed. There and then. That's pretty self-explanatory. The fifth is when personal data has to be erased in order to comply with a legal obligation, which is fine. If you're being sued to have your data removed, I would suggest probably listening to them and delete the data. Or if there are some legal obligations around a lawsuit, etc. And the last one is when you're processing the data of a child. Obviously, we have to be respectful of children's data and minors' data when processing. So if you run a business that processes the data of minors, I would assume that you already have really robust data policies already. But if you're asked to remove the data from a minor, then you should remove that. Quite interestingly, the UK is introducing the data protection bill that brings the GDPR into law after Brexit at some point in time. And they've added on stricter regulations around processing minors' data. They've increased the age to 18, and anyone under the age of 18 who would like their data removed from social media, the social media companies have to comply and completely wipe out their profiles from there. And currently, there is no mechanism to be able to do that. So the Salesforce approach, what are Salesforce doing? So Salesforce in this chain are the data processor. We know this. We take our data, we give it to Salesforce. If you're an ISV, you will have seen a few ISV webinars and documentation that have come out saying that you and Salesforce are joint processors. So you need to make sure that your applications respect data privacy laws as well and have ways of tracking those lawful basis in your tools if they're using personal data. So we're lucky. Salesforce is at its core a CRM system. We're already using it to manage our personal data. We've got loads of out-of-the-box functionality, we've got history being tracked, and we've got the flexibility to cope with these changes because of the platform capabilities. Now, so as a data processor, Salesforce have 3 responsibilities. And a lot of people don't agree with these, but this is what they are. They have to keep themselves compliant. Salesforce are a very large organization. I can't even begin to imagine how the legal team at Salesforce have kept Salesforce compliant with hundreds of thousands of customers, people using this platform, and internally, giant sales teams making sure that they're going to be compliant as a platform by the deadline. They have to enable their product. They've had to do massive changes in the way that Salesforce logs on the back end because of the way that it was collecting personal data. And they have to make sure that their product can be used in a compliant way. And then the third is to educate their customers. Salesforce are required to educate their customers and make sure that they know to make the right decisions when processing this data. They don't have an obligation to make sure that you're compliant. They've done their job now, so now you need to take it away, you need to set your policies, and you need to build tools to keep you compliant in the way that your business works. Some of the examples of the things that they provided, there's a great trail on European data privacy law basics that everyone should hopefully have by now. And they've released a data processing addendum, which if you're a customer, you need to download and countersign. If you are a partner, you need to encourage your customers to go and countersign this agreement, because what it is an amendment to your data processing agreement with Salesforce, outlining how they're processing data. Now, obviously, we've all noticed there are some platform changes. The first one is the individual object, which we'll get into in a second. The third is internal logging on the platform. And then the third is now there's an Apex method for user deletion coming in the next release. So you can, so I say that, user deletion. It's now been clarified as only being obfuscation, which isn't a bad thing. But you can now call a method to anonymize user data, which works out great for any of us who are stuck in communities and have thousands of users that we probably shouldn't be storing any longer. But because of the complexity of the platform, it's just not possible to delete users.
So it will automatically anonymize the users for you?
Yeah, you have to write a class and it'll anonymize them. It's actually really cool. You can play around it in the pre-release orgs now. So the individual object. Now, before we talk about it, it's a standard object. You must enable it through data privacy and protection settings. There are no storage limits because it's a standard object. It's related to the contact record, lead record, person account, and user by default. There is a caveat, though, with the user in that you cannot add the related list for users onto the individual object page layout. And the user lookup field for the individual can only be put on the user profile, not on the user record and setup. So what it is, though, is it's a system of record. You use the individual to track one-off changes to their personal data preferences. So it's about tracking actions like don't process, don't market, don't profile, don't track. This isn't a consenting mechanism. This is a mechanism to store that history around what someone has asked you to do to their data. So it's not necessarily a solution, but it's just something that you can aid. And it allows you to relate your leads, users, contacts, and multiple records to this individual, almost creating a single hub for a single person and their multiple roles within the Salesforce environment. Now, there are some limitations. The first one is that when you turn on the individual object, it does not backfill the records for you. You have to do that via Apex. The second is that you must create the record manually now from now on, currently. So when you go to create the individual object, you'll create a contact, you'll then create the individual object. You're having to re-key in the first and last name of that person because there's not a mechanism right now to do that for you. Obviously, you could program that into the platform. There are no declarative tools currently, except for I was corrected, you can access the individual in Flow. But in the next release, you can access the individual in Process Builder and in Workflow Rules. And there are no Lightning page layouts. So you can't build components and you can't update the Lightning page for the individual, which I find really annoying because I've got loads of really cool ideas I'd like to put onto the individual that we can't. And I can confirm as well that in the current pre-release organ notes, you still cannot update the Lightning page in summer 18, which is slightly disappointing. And so some key takeaways. In theory, Salesforce have given you a framework to comply. They've given you the individual object. You've got loads of process automation capabilities. You've got some guidance from Trailhead. You've got docs. And you, in theory, can combine all of those things to comply. But going beyond that, the 4 things that you need to do now are documenting your org and understanding how personal data flows through your org. And make sure that that has an exit point, because you should not be keeping any data forever. The second one is to understand and maintain your data landscape. There's lots of legacy data out there. You need to analyze that data, and you need to understand where it came from and why you have it. If you can't answer those 2 questions, it should not be in your orgs, and you should not own it as an organization. The third one is to be ready for requests. Requests aren't going to be flooding in, but I already have a list of ISVs that I'm going to be emailing on the 25th of May saying, why? Because I was scanned at a badge somewhere 10 years ago and they still have my information and think that I want their product. And then the fourth one is don't panic. The regulators aren't going to come knocking down on loads of doors. And they're already talking to you if they are. I know there are about 30 organizations in the UK that the regulators are already working with to make sure that they're on the right track. But this isn't like a May 25th and everyone's going to forget about it. This is a change in the way that we use data. More on that in a second, but just be ready to ease into the transition and change your ways of working coming into this regulation. So I'm going to give you a quick demo. I'm constantly asked if I can come and consult on GDPR, and I always say no, because I don't want to. So I took all of my knowledge and put it into an AppExchange package, alongside a company that lots of us know called Elements Cloud, who are just an incredible app in the compliance space. And from meeting them about a year ago, the relationship that we built was very strong. And so we're now taking it to market, and it should be on the AppExchange in a couple of days. So let's have a quick demo. So this is the privacy app. You install it into your orgs. This is what it looks like in setup. And we have a few things that you need to understand before you can actually use the app. So we've got this concept of communication rules. So communication rules are a combination of content and channels. So content would be things like sending product updates, sending blog posts, user events, via email, via fax, via phone, whatever that you're using as your communication rules and the way that you contact your customers. And the second one is this concept of privacy sources. And so sources are the ways in which you acquire the data. For example, exchanging business cards. You can then cross-sect those with these communication rules. So for example, if you exchange business cards with someone, you can send them product updates by email or user invites by a phone, etc. And you use this to create very rich templates for your data acquisition and what you're allowed to do with that data. Now, when we look at those records specifically, this is just a couple of examples that I've already had a look at today. And the first one is like, an example would be an event invitation. So an event invitation that has a channel of email with a quick description for the users to use and access. Because this is something that would be set up between an admin or a partner and the business themselves initially. And the second one is we take privacy sources. And so an example of a privacy source would be this workshop registration page. The source of the data is online. The lawful basis is consent. And we actually have here a privacy notice that's been approved by marketing. Let me just zoom in a bit, that we can then add to our pages for event registration, and the fact that it requires explicit opt-in. We now take that a step further and we set a retention policy. So anytime someone registers for a workshop, we're going to store their data for 9 months, and we're going to communicate with them for 6 months. And it's very important that we have these purpose and storage limitations, because in theory, that's what this record is. We can then assign communication rules to this via a dual list box so that we can create and destroy those as we go. So let me show you how this works. The record that we're creating is called a privacy permission. When you create a privacy permission, you're opening up access to using that data. So if we look at this first contact, Stella, we go to her record and we can see that there are no active permissions on the account, so there's nothing that we can legally do. So we need to go in and do that. If this was integrated with my event management system, I would be creating the privacy record off the back of the event registration, but I'm going to create it manually for this demonstration. So you can see we can select that source type of the data, and we'll say it's online. It will then display a list of the sources, and I'm going to select workshop registration. Now, it's going to use that as a template for this permission that we're about to create. So it's set a start date for me as a default today, but we can set that back in time if necessary. We can add a description, so I'm going to say we registered for Dream Olay 18. And I'm going to say they agreed to the privacy notice. Now, it's taking that privacy notice from that permission, or from that source that we set earlier, and we know that it's required. So when I create that, it's going to save the record for me. Obviously, it's going to dismiss the banner. And we now have a privacy permission record on this contact that expires on the 27th of January. So we know that that record will then last for that amount of time. And when a sales rep or someone from the business goes into their contact record, they can see quickly and easily what we're allowed to do with the data. Now, because these are just built from a template, they're actually children to the privacy permission, and we can unsubscribe specifically from them if we no longer want to receive those communications. And because DML is happening on those records, we can easily integrate that into our marketing systems that we're currently using to track back that information. And so if now I go into the workshop registration, I can see that we've got a history of when it registered, their agreement to the privacy notice that they agreed to specifically, and we can see those privacy opt-ins that we've unsubscribed from these event invitations and blog posts via fax. In the same sense, if we go, I'm going to withdraw this privacy permission now because they don't want to receive it anymore. So if we save that, I'm just going to put some demo text there, test. Great, so I've withdrawn this privacy permission. We're going to go back to Stella, and when we navigate to this record, we're going to see that their registration is no longer valid. Do a quick refresh on that, because I don't have my clear cache on here. And you can see, great, it's turned that over to expired. It set the expiration date to today, and we've now withdrawn that permission. In theory, you should now run a report that says we have all of this expired data. We should no longer be using it. So that's just a quick overview of how you can comply. We've released the framework for this online. I'll send around the blog after the event today, but you can go out and build this yourself if you like. Because it's just a basic consenting model that we've put together into Salesforce. Now, on to my very last slide. I know I've gotten into some Q&A time, but feel free to reach out to me anytime today. We must rethink the way that we act with personal data and the way that we think with personal data. There's a massive change to reporting. Marketing, it changes. The statistics and the analytics that you're relying on are no longer valid, because you can only have that data for that specific purpose and that specific amount of time. And we can no longer profile customers to the extent that we are at the moment. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. I don't know if we have 5 minutes for some questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Is the app well documented?
Yes. I think it's like 40 pages.
Only?
Yeah, only. It's very lightweight, actually.
Are you sharing profit with your lawyer, or?
Yeah, tell me about it. I'm not a lawyer. Yes.
One question. What if you have information or data from other sources, SAP or Oracle, or how can you manage a request and then
of course
send the request to those systems saying, guys, you cannot keep that data?
Yeah, so there is, hold on, sorry, let me formulate this. I just had the answer in my head. So a good example, I was at a presentation the other day of a load of architects around EMEA, and there's an organization that I will tell you who it is later, I don't want to name it on video, who has millions of systems. They run globally. They're a big television provider service that run loads of things. Yeah. And what they've done is they have a single identity system for managing their personal data, obviously because they're a massive organization. And what they do is they then have that massive identity provider that is actually providing their consents, and then all of their external applications are communicating to that identity provider. And so when someone asks to be removed, they then have a janitor that goes and scrubs the data from each system. So it depends on who you want to be your provider. Salesforce is built very well to do that. So if you're then tracking when data expires, we're going to take care of the data deletion in Salesforce in a future iteration of the product, in a couple of weeks actually. But you need to be able to tell the other systems that this data needs to be removed. Now, when gaining permissions, you need to understand where that data is coming from. You need to create some sort of record acknowledging that this is where the data has come from and which system and why it's come from that system. Cool. Yes?
So we've been talking a lot about structured data, the CRM data.
Yeah.
How about best practices around unstructured data? Let's think about chatter posts. Next release, I think we got the possibility to mention records
Yeah.
in chatter posts, so you would see a person's name, for example.
Yeah.
And to my knowledge, there's no easy way to deal and manage that so far.
And you know what? There might not be, but look at a specific policy for things like chatter. I know organizations who don't keep chatter posts for longer than 3 months, for example. Or if you know anyone that's really good at machine learning, you can train models to identify personal data and then anonymize them in unstructured data sets and then update the chatter posts. That's probably going way too far, but eventually I'm sure that something would be introduced to do that, or identify when there is.
So you talked about purpose limitation.
Yes.
But I've seen some terms and conditions from organizations where the purpose is too broad, so that they can get around this whole.
We'll see if it stands the test of the regulators. Yeah, I don't know what the thoughts are, but my understanding is that the second when the regulators come in, you have to justify your position. And so when you're looking at a data set, you need to be able to justify the decisions that you've made as an organization. It doesn't matter what those decisions are, but as long as you can justify them, then you should be okay, as long as they're not unreasonable. Yeah. Yes?
So the application, is it integrated in any way with the Journey Builder?
We're working on Pardot right now.
Okay.
We're trying to figure out
Okay.
Marketing Cloud integration. In theory, if you have any Marketing Cloud experts who want to chat to me, come and chat to me. But we're doing DML on the privacy opt-in records specifically every time they're, obviously when they're created, but when they're expired or unsubscribed. And so you can trigger off of those really easily.
So you could do something through the API?
Yeah. Any other questions?
What do you do with Pardot then?
With Pardot then? Currently we're exploring the use of lists, of public lists, and then associating those privacy permissions and those communication rules to Pardot lists specifically. And so that when a permission is expired, we can then query Pardot lists that have those communication rules associated to them and then look for those people. Yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way of doing it. Yes?
Will you be sharing the slides?
Yes, everything's been recorded today as well. Perfect. Thank you very much for coming. Reach out to me, ask any questions. I've got loads of stickers here for the GDPR superheroes and for the privacy manager, so take some and spread the word. Thank you.